The sun was setting over Redemption Springs, painting the sky orange and purple. Inside the old town hall, the wooden floors creaked under the weight of nervous footsteps. It was October 1887, and this small town in the middle of nowhere had seen better days. The mines had closed 2 years ago, and most of the young men had left to find work elsewhere. Sheriff Tom Brennan stood at the front of the room, looking at the crowd that had gathered. He was a tall man with a gray mustache and tired eyes. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, and in all that time he'd never done anything quite like this. But these were desperate times, and desperate times needed unusual solutions. The town needed workers. The ranches needed hands. The shops needed customers. And men like Jack Morrison, well, they needed a reason to stay. Jack had saved the sheriff's life just 3 weeks ago. A group of robbers had stormed into the bank, shooting wildly. When one of them pointed a gun at the sheriff's back, Jack had tackled the man without thinking twice. He'd risked his own life for a lawman he barely knew. That kind of courage deserved a reward. The sheriff had asked Jack what he wanted. Money, land, a better job. But Jack's answer had been simple and surprising. He wanted a wife. He was 32 years old, had spent the last 10 years working on different ranches, moving from place to place. He was tired of being alone. He wanted a home, a family, someone to share his life with. That's how this strange evening had come to be. 11 women stood along the wall of the town hall. Some looked hopeful, others looked uncomfortable. A few looked downright terrified. The sheriff had explained the situation to the town, and these 11 women had agreed to participate. They had their own reasons. Some were desperate to escape poverty. Others had no family and feared becoming old maids. A few genuinely hoped to find love in this unconventional way. Among them stood Rose Mitchell, and she wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. She was 28 years old and had lived in Redemption Springs her entire life. She worked as a seamstress, making clothes for the town's families. She was good at her job, her fingers quick and skilled with needle and thread. But Rose was also a large woman. She weighed close to 200 pounds, maybe more. She didn't own a scale and didn't want to know the exact number. In a time when women were supposed to be delicate and small, Rose felt like she took up too much space everywhere she went. She hadn't wanted to come tonight. The whole thing felt humiliating, standing in a line like cattle at an auction, waiting to be chosen or rejected. But her younger sister Lily had begged her to come. Lily was also in the line, and she was scared. She wanted her big sister there for support, so Rose had agreed, telling herself she was just there for Lily. No man would choose her anyway. She'd made peace with that years ago. She'd be the one left unchosen at the end, and that was fine. She'd go home, back to her small house and her sewing, and life would continue as it always had. The room was packed with curious townspeople. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. They whispered behind their hands, making guesses about who Jack would choose. Most of the whispers centered around pretty young Alice, the banker's daughter with perfect curls and a tiny waist. Or maybe he'd pick Catherine, the school teacher with the sweet voice who could read Latin. Jack stood near the door, his hat in his hands. He was a lean man, weathered by years of outdoor work. His face was tanned and lined, his hands rough and calloused. He wasn't particularly handsome, but there was something solid and dependable about him. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to another. The sheriff cleared his throat. The room fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. "Jack Morrison," the sheriff said in his deep voice. "You saved my life. You asked for a bride, and these fine women have agreed to meet you. According to our arrangement, you may choose any one of them to be your wife. Choose wisely, son." Jack nodded slowly. He stepped forward, and every woman in that line held her breath. He walked along the line, looking at each face. He didn't linger or stare rudely. He just looked as if he was searching for something specific. Rose kept her eyes down. She didn't want to see pity in his face when he looked at her. She didn't want to see him quickly look away, the way men always did. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she wished this whole thing would just be over. But then the footsteps stopped. Right in front of her, Rose slowly lifted her eyes. Jack was standing there, directly in front of her, looking at her face, not looking past her, not looking through her, looking at her. The room was so quiet you could hear the wind outside. Then Jack lifted his arm and pointed. His finger aimed straight at Rose. Someone gasped. Whispers exploded across the room like firecrackers. Rose felt dizzy. This couldn't be happening. She must have misunderstood. Maybe he was pointing at someone behind her, except there was only a wall behind her. Jack walked closer. He stopped a respectful distance away and held his hat against his chest. His voice was quiet but steady. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Jack Morrison. I know this whole situation isn't normal or proper. I know we don't know each other, but I'd be real honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." Rose couldn't speak. Her mouth opened but no words came out. She looked at Lily, who was staring with wide eyes. She looked at the crowd, where mouths hung open in shock. She looked back at Jack, searching his face for mockery or cruelty or some kind of joke, but his green eyes were kind. There was no laughter there, no trick. He looked nervous, like he was worried she might say no. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why me?" It was the question everyone in the room wanted answered. Why would he choose her when he could have any of the prettier, smaller, more delicate women standing there? Jack's answer was simple and honest. "A few minutes before the sheriff started talking, I saw you smile at your sister. You were trying to make her feel less scared. That smile, it reminded me of something I've been missing my whole life. It reminded me what a real home should feel like. Warm and kind and safe." He paused, then continued. "I'm not looking for the prettiest woman or the fanciest one. I'm looking for a good heart and a strong spirit. And I saw both of those things in you." The room erupted in noise. People were talking over each other, shocked and excited and scandalized all at once. The sheriff had to shout for quiet. Lily grabbed Rose's hand and squeezed it hard. "Say yes," she whispered urgently. "Rose, say yes." Rose looked at Jack again. She'd spent her whole life being invisible to men, being the one they looked over or around. She'd learned to protect herself by expecting nothing. But here was this cowboy, this stranger, looking at her like she was exactly what he'd been hoping to find. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe he'd regret this choice tomorrow. Maybe this whole thing was a terrible idea that would end in heartbreak. But maybe, just maybe, it was the chance she'd stopped believing would ever come. Rose took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Yes, I'll consider it." Jack's face broke into a smile, and for the first time that evening, Rose felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt chosen. She felt wanted. And even though she was terrified, she also felt a tiny spark of hope beginning to glow in her chest. The whispers started the second Jack pointed at Rose. At first they were quiet, like the buzzing of bees, but they quickly grew louder. People weren't even trying to hide their shock anymore. Mrs. Henderson, the butcher's wife, spoke loud enough for half the room to hear. "Well, I never thought I'd see the day. He could have picked Alice or Catherine, and he chose her." Old Mr. Peterson shook his head in disbelief. "That cowboy must have hit his head during that bank robbery. There's no other explanation." Rose heard every word. She'd spent her whole life hearing comments like these, sometimes to her face but usually behind her back. Each word was like a small cut, and over the years she'd collected so many cuts that she'd built walls around her heart to protect it. But something was different this time. Jack was still standing in front of her, and he hadn't moved away despite all the talking. He hadn't changed his mind. He wasn't looking around the room with regret. He was just waiting patiently for her to really answer him. The sheriff banged his hand on the table. "That's enough. Show some respect. Jack has made his choice, and that's the end of it." The room quieted down, but the stares continued. Rose could feel dozens of eyes on her, judging, questioning, wondering. She wanted to run out of that town hall and never come back. But Lily still had her hand, holding it tight, giving her strength. Jack took a small step closer. Up close, Rose could see details she'd missed before. His face was weathered but young, probably only a few years older than her. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow. His hands were rough and calloused from hard work, but they were clean. He'd clearly made an effort to wash up before coming here tonight. Ma'am, I know this is a lot to take in, Jack said quietly, speaking just to her now, not to the crowd. I'm not asking you to decide everything right now. Maybe we could talk, get to know each other a bit before you make up your mind for sure. Rose found her voice, though it still shook. I don't understand. You could have chosen anyone here. Alice has been making eyes at every single man in this town for 2 years. Catherine can play piano and speak 3 languages. And you chose me? Jack looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. Can I be honest with you? Please, Rose said. She needed to understand this. I've been working ranches since I was 17 years old, Jack said. 15 years of moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. I've seen a lot of pretty faces in that time. Pretty is nice to look at, sure, but it doesn't keep you warm when you're alone. It doesn't make a house feel like a home. He looked back up at her. 3 months ago, I came to town for supplies. I saw you outside the general store. There was an old Chinese lady, Mrs. Chen, struggling with her groceries. Her bags had torn and things were falling everywhere. Most people walked right past her. But you stopped. You helped her pick everything up, and then you carried her groceries all the way to her house even though it was clear out of your way. Rose remembered that day. She hadn't known anyone was watching. Mrs. Chen is old and her hands hurt. It wasn't right to just leave her there. Exactly, Jack said. You helped her because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone was watching or because you'd get something out of it. That told me what kind of person you are. He continued. Then another time I saw you give your lunch to those 2 orphan boys who hang around the church. You thought no one saw that either. And once I heard you defending the Rodriguez family when people were saying cruel things about them. Just because they're from Mexico, you stood up for them when no one else would. Rose felt her face getting hot. She didn't think anyone had noticed any of those things. They were just small acts, nothing special. Just treating people the way they deserve to be treated. So yeah, Jack said. I could have chosen someone prettier or fancier, but I chose someone kind, someone strong, someone who does the right thing even when it's hard. That's worth more than a pretty face, at least to me. For a moment, Rose couldn't speak. No one had ever talked about her like this before. No one had ever seen these parts of her. Or if they had, they'd never mentioned it. She'd always been just the big girl, or the seamstress, or poor Rose who can't find a husband. But Jack had been watching. He'd seen her when she thought she was invisible, and somehow he'd seen something worth choosing. Lily squeezed her hand again. Rose, talk to him, she whispered. Give him a chance, the sheriff spoke up. Jack, why don't you and Miss Rose step outside for a bit? Have a proper conversation without all these nosy folks listening in. That got a few nervous laughs from the crowd, which broke some of the tension. Jack offered his arm to Rose like a proper gentleman. She hesitated for just a second, then took it. His arm was solid and steady under her hand. They walked outside together, leaving the buzzing crowd behind. The evening air was cool and fresh. The sun had set completely now, and stars were starting to appear in the darkening sky. They walked a little ways from the building, where the noise of the crowd faded to a distant murmur. For a minute, neither of them spoke. Rose didn't know where to start. This whole evening felt like a dream, and she was afraid she might wake up any second. I should tell you about myself, Jack finally said. It's only fair you know who I am before you decide anything. All right, Rose said. I work at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles outside of town. I've been there for 2 years now, which is the longest I've stayed anywhere. The owner, Mr. Roberts, he's getting old. He's offered to sell me a piece of his land at a fair price. I've been saving up and I almost have enough. He looked out at the dark horizon. I'm not rich and I probably never will be. Ranch work is hard and doesn't pay much. But I'm good at it and I love it. Being outside, working with horses and cattle, fixing fences, watching things grow. It's a good life. A simple life. That sounds nice, Rose said, and she meant it. She'd always liked simple things herself. I've got a small house on the property. It's just 2 rooms right now, but it's solid. Good roof, warm stove. I built most of it myself. He paused. It's lonely, though. A house isn't a home when you're the only one in it. Rose understood that feeling. Her own small house often felt empty, even though she'd lived there for years. What about you? Jack asked. Tell me about yourself. Rose wasn't used to people asking about her life. I'm a seamstress. I make clothes for people in town. Dresses, shirts, alterations, that sort of thing. I learned from my mother before she passed 5 years ago. You're good at it, Jack said. I've heard people talk. They say you're the best seamstress in 3 counties. Rose felt a small glow of pride. I like the work. There's something satisfying about taking pieces of fabric and turning them into something useful and beautiful. They talked for over an hour. Small things, important things. They talked about their families, their dreams, their fears. Jack told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to fever when he was 16. Rose told him about her father leaving when she was young, about raising Lily when their mother got sick. The conversation was easy, natural. Rose found herself laughing at Jack's stories about stubborn horses and ornery cattle. Jack seemed genuinely interested when she talked about the challenges of fitting different body types and working with difficult fabrics. Finally, the sheriff came outside. Folks are getting restless in there. What's the verdict? Jack looked at Rose. I meant what I said inside. I'd be honored to have you as my wife. But only if you want that too. This has to be your choice, Rose. I won't pressure you. Rose took a deep breath. Every logical part of her brain said this was crazy. They'd known each other for barely 2 hours. Marriage was serious, permanent. What if he changed his mind? What if he woke up one day and regretted choosing her? But then she looked into his honest green eyes and saw something that changed her mind. She saw respect. She saw hope. She saw a man who'd chosen her not despite who she was, but because of who she was. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Yes, Rose said firmly. Yes, I'll marry you, Jack Morrison. And when Jack smiled, really smiled, Rose felt that tiny spark of hope in her chest grow a little brighter. 3 weeks passed in a blur. Rose barely had time to think about what she'd agreed to before it was happening. The wedding was set for a Saturday afternoon, same town hall where Jack had chosen her. It seemed fitting somehow to start where they'd begun. Rose spent those 3 weeks in a state of constant anxiety. She sewed her own wedding dress, a cream-colored creation that she'd designed herself. She made it twice. The first time it fit perfectly, but her nerves had her eating more than usual, and by the second week she couldn't button it. So she stayed up late, letting out all the seams, adding panels, making it bigger. Lily tried to help, but she could see her sister's stress. Rose, you need to calm down. You're going to make yourself sick. I can't help it, Rose said, her fingers flying over the fabric. What if he changes his mind? What if he looks at me on our wedding day and realizes he's made a terrible mistake?
He's not going to do that, Lily said firmly.
I've seen the way he looks at you. That man chose you, Rose. He wants you. But Rose couldn't quiet the voices in her head. And unfortunately, the voices in her head weren't the only problem. The voices in town were even louder. The gossip spread like wildfire. Everyone had an opinion about the upcoming wedding, and most of those opinions weren't kind. Rose heard fragments everywhere she went. At the general store, 2 women stood by the flour barrels. I heard he's only marrying her because the sheriff is giving him land, one said. No other reason a man would choose her. Poor man, the other replied. He's probably regretting it already, but doesn't know how to get out of it. At church the following Sunday, Rose sat in her usual pew with Lily. Behind them, she could hear Mrs. Henderson whispering to her friend. That wedding is going to be a disaster. Can you imagine the poor horse that has to pull the carriage with her in it? The woman laughed, not quietly enough. Rose kept her eyes forward, her face burning, pretending she hadn't heard. But Lily heard it too. She turned around, her young face fierce. That's my sister you're talking about. Have some respect. Mrs. Henderson had the decency to look embarrassed, but the damage was done. Rose felt sick for the rest of the service. Even people who meant well said hurtful things without realizing it. The baker's wife pulled Rose aside one day. Dear, are you sure about this? You barely know this man. What if he's only interested in your father's old property? Men can be tricky about these things. Rose's father had owned a small piece of land before he'd left. It wasn't worth much, just a few acres outside town. But people assumed that's what Jack was after. The worst comment came from old Mr. Peterson at the hardware store. Well, Morrison must really need a wife badly to settle for. Well, you know. No offense meant, of course, Rose smiled tightly. Of course. But inside each word was another cut. She didn't tell Jack about any of it. They met several times during those 3 weeks. Always with Lily as a chaperone, always proper and respectful. They talked about their plans, about the house, about what their life might look like. Jack was kind and patient, and Rose found herself actually looking forward to their meetings. But she couldn't shake the fear that everyone was right. That he'd wake up one day and realize what a mistake he'd made. Finally, the wedding day arrived. Rose stood in the small room behind the town hall, looking at herself in the cracked mirror. The cream dress fit barely. Her face was pale with nerves. Lily stood behind her, adjusting the simple flowers in Rose's hair. "You look beautiful," Lily said. "I look scared," Rose replied honestly. "That too," Lily admitted. "But that's normal. Every bride is scared on her wedding day." The door opened and the sheriff poked his head in. "Ready, ladies?" Jack's waiting and he looks about ready to jump out of his skin with nerves. That made Rose feel slightly better. At least she wasn't the only one who was terrified. They walked to the main hall. The room was packed. It seemed like the entire town had showed up, probably more out of curiosity than well wishes. Rose could feel every eye on her as she walked down the aisle. She heard the whispers, saw the looks, but then she saw Jack, standing at the front of the room, and everything else faded a bit. He was wearing his best clothes, which wasn't saying much. A clean shirt, worn trousers, boots that had been polished until they shined. His hair was slicked back and he'd shaved. He looked nervous and hopeful and scared all at once. When Rose reached him, he smiled. It was a small smile just for her, and it said everything he couldn't say out loud in front of all these people. "You look wonderful," he whispered. The ceremony was simple. The local preacher read the traditional words. Rose and Jack repeated their vows, their voices steady despite their nerves. Jack's hand shook slightly when he slid the simple gold band onto Rose's finger. Rose's eyes filled with tears when it was her turn to put the ring on his hand. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said. This was it. Their first kiss. In front of everyone. Rose's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Jack stepped closer. He was gentle, so gentle. He cupped her face in his rough, work-worn hands and looked into her eyes for just a moment. Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and respectful. It was brief, appropriate for a public ceremony, but it was real. When they pulled apart, Rose saw something in his eyes that she'd been afraid to hope for. He wasn't disappointed. He wasn't regretful. He looked happy. The crowd clapped politely, though Rose heard a few snickers mixed in. She tried to ignore them. This was her wedding day. She wasn't going to let cruel people ruin it. There was a small reception with cake and punch. People congratulated them, some genuinely, others clearly just being polite. Alice, the banker's daughter who everyone thought Jack should have chosen, came up to them. "Congratulations," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you'll be very happy together." "Thank you," Rose said quietly. After Alice walked away, Jack leaned close to Rose's ear. "I don't regret my choice," he whispered. "Not for a second." Those words meant more to Rose than anything else that day. Finally, as the sun began to set, it was time to leave. Jack had borrowed a wagon to take them to the ranch. As they walked outside, Mrs. Henderson's voice carried clearly from inside. "Well, that's done. I give it 6 months before he realizes what he's gotten himself into and starts looking elsewhere." Rose froze. The words hit her like a physical blow. 6 months. That's how long people thought this marriage would last. But Jack heard it too. He stopped walking and turned around. He didn't yell or make a scene. He simply walked back to the doorway where Mrs. Henderson stood, her face going red as she realized he'd heard. "Ma'am," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "I chose Rose from a room full of women. I married her today in front of God and this whole town. She's my wife now, and I'll thank you to show her the respect she deserves. If you can't do that, then we don't need your opinion or your company." He tipped his hat politely, took Rose's hand and led her to the wagon. Rose felt tears in her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of hurt. They were tears of gratitude. As they rode away from town toward the ranch, toward their new life together, Jack reached over and took her hand. "I meant what I said in there. You're my wife, Rose. That means something to me. That means everything to me." Rose squeezed his hand back. She was still scared. She still didn't quite believe this was real. But for the first time in her life, she felt defended, protected, chosen. That night, when they arrived at the small ranch house that would be their home, Jack showed her the bedroom he'd prepared. It had a real bed with a quilt, curtains on the window, even a small vase with wildflowers on the dresser. "I'll sleep in the spare room," Jack said, "until you're comfortable. I know this is all new and probably overwhelming. We don't have to rush anything, Rose. This marriage starts with respect. Everything else can come in its own time. Rose looked at this man who'd defended her in front of the whole town, who'd prepared a room for her, who was willing to sleep separately until she felt safe. And she realized that maybe, just maybe, the gossips were wrong. Maybe this marriage had a real chance after all. The first month of marriage was strange. Rose and Jack lived in the same house, ate meals together, said good morning and good night. But they were like two polite strangers sharing a space, both careful not to intrude on the other's life too much. Jack left before sunrise every morning. Ranch work started early and didn't care about newlywed adjustments. He'd quietly make coffee in the kitchen, trying not to wake Rose, though she was usually already awake, lying in bed and listening to him move around. He'd return after sunset, dusty and tired. Rose would have dinner ready, the table set, everything neat and clean. They'd eat together, talking about safe, simple things. The weather, the ranch, what Rose was sewing, what Jack had fixed that day. It was all very polite, very proper, very lonely. Rose threw herself into being a good wife. She cooked every meal from scratch. She cleaned every corner of the small house until it sparkled. She mended Jack's worn work clothes, patched his torn shirts, sewed buttons back on his jackets. She baked bread every other day, made preserves, kept the kitchen stocked. She was trying to prove something, though she couldn't quite say what. Maybe that she was worth keeping. Worth the choice he'd made. Jack, for his part, worked himself nearly to exhaustion. He fixed every broken thing on the ranch. He repaired fences that didn't really need repairing. He organized the barn twice. He stayed busy from dawn until dark, as if hard work could bridge the awkward gap between them. They were both trying so hard, but somehow missing each other completely. 3 weeks into the marriage, something small changed. Rose was reading one evening after dinner, one of her old books that she'd read a dozen times before. She'd always loved to read ever since she was a little girl. Books took her places she'd never been, showed her lives different from her own. Jack noticed. "You like reading," he said. It wasn't a question, just an observation. Rose looked up, surprised. "Yes, since I was young. My mother taught me. She said reading opens up the whole world." "What are you reading now?" Rose showed him the worn cover. It was a novel about a family traveling west. She'd read it so many times the pages were falling out. Jack nodded thoughtfully but didn't say more. That was the end of the conversation. But 2 days later, when Jack came home from town with supplies, he had something extra. A book. A new book, with a stiff cover and crisp pages that had never been opened. The general store owner said it just came in. Jack said, almost shyly, handing it to her, "I thought you might like it." Rose stared at the book in her hands. No one had ever bought her a book before. They were expensive, considered luxury items. She'd always borrowed or bought used copies when she could scrape together enough coins. "Jack, this must have cost—" "I wanted to," he interrupted. "You work hard keeping the house. Seemed only fair you should have something you enjoy." That night, Rose stayed up late reading by lamplight, and for the first time since the wedding, she fell asleep with a smile on her face. After that, Jack brought her a book every few weeks. Sometimes he'd go to town specifically for that purpose. Rose started leaving warm milk by his bedside at night because she'd noticed he sometimes woke up thrashing and sweating, caught in nightmares he never talked about. One night, she heard him cry out. She was up and in his room before she thought about it. "Jack, are you all right?" He was sitting up in bed, breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat. "Sorry," he said, his voice rough. "Didn't mean to wake you. Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head. "Old memories, the war. They come back sometimes at night." Rose didn't push. She just brought him the warm milk she'd started preparing. "This helps sometimes. Something my mother used to make when I couldn't sleep." Jack drank it slowly. "Thank you." After that, he slept better. Not perfect, but better. And Rose felt like maybe she'd found a small way to help him, just as he'd found ways to help her. But they were still dancing around each other, still careful, still not quite connecting. Then came the storm. It was late afternoon when the sky turned dark green. Jack was out checking the far fence line where some of the horses sometimes broke through. Rose was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the wind pick up. Within minutes, it was howling. Rain pounded against the windows like thrown rocks. Thunder crashed so loud it shook the house, and Jack wasn't home. Rose waited. An hour passed, then 2. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it got worse. She stood at the window, straining to see anything through the sheets of rain, but there was nothing. Just darkness and water and wind. By the third hour, Rose was terrified. Something was wrong. Jack knew this land. He should have been home by now, storm or no storm. She made a decision. She wasn't going to sit there waiting while Jack might be hurt somewhere. She bundled up in every piece of rain gear she could find. She wrapped herself in oilcloth. She pulled on boots and a heavy coat. Then she went to the barn. The horses were nervous, stamping and whinnying in their stalls. Rose picked the two calmest ones. She'd never hitched a team by herself before, but she'd watched Jack do it dozens of times. Her hands shook as she worked, but she got it done. She climbed onto the wagon seat and headed out into the storm. The rain was so heavy she could barely see 5 feet ahead. The wind nearly tore her off the seat. Lightning split the sky, making the horses shy and pull, but Rose kept going. She knew roughly where the far fence line was. She drove the wagon slowly, carefully, stopping every few minutes to call out Jack's name. She'd been out for almost an hour when she finally heard something, a weak shout barely audible over the storm. She drove toward it, and there was Jack. He was on the ground next to the fence. His horse was nearby, favoring one leg. Jack was conscious but clearly in pain. "Rose?" He looked shocked to see her. "What are you doing out here?" "It's dangerous." "So is leaving you out here," Rose said, climbing down from the wagon. "Can you move?" "My ankle," Jack said through gritted teeth. "I think it's broken. Horse threw me when lightning struck near us." Rose looked at Jack, then at the wagon, then back at Jack. He was a lean man, but he still weighed probably 160 pounds. She needed to get him into that wagon somehow. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. "It already hurts," Jack said with a weak smile. Rose got her arms under his shoulders. She'd been strong her whole life, stronger than most women, stronger than some men. She'd had to be. And now all that strength had a purpose. She lifted, pulled, dragged. Jack helped as much as he could, pushing with his good leg. Inch by inch, they got him into the back of the wagon. The ride home was terrifying. The storm raged around them. The horses were spooked. Rose had to fight to keep them under control, to keep them moving forward, to keep the wagon from sliding off the muddy road. But she did it. She got them home. She got Jack into the house. She got him dry and warm and examined his ankle, which was swollen to twice its normal size. For the next 3 days, Rose barely slept. She took care of Jack, brought him food, changed his bandages, helped him when he needed to move. The doctor came and confirmed the ankle was broken, would need weeks to heal. During those 3 days, something changed between them. They talked, really talked. Jack told her about the war, about the things he'd seen that still haunted him. Rose told him about her childhood, about the kids who'd teased her, about learning to be invisible to protect herself. They shared stories and fears and hopes. Without the awkwardness of trying to be perfect, they just became real with each other. On the 4th day, when Jack was finally able to sit up properly, he looked at Rose seriously. "You saved my life out there. In that storm. I would have died if you hadn't come." "You would have done the same for me," Rose said. "Maybe," Jack admitted, "but I'm not sure I would have been strong enough to do what you did. Getting me into that wagon, driving through that storm. Rose, you're one of the strongest people I've ever met, and I'm not just talking about physical strength." He reached out and took her hand. "I know this first month has been awkward. We've been dancing around each other, both trying so hard to be what we think the other wants. But I need you to know something. I don't want you to try to be perfect. I just want you to be you, the real you." Rose felt tears prick her eyes. "I've been so scared that you'd regret choosing me, that I wouldn't be enough." "Rose," Jack said gently, "you're not just enough. You're everything I hoped you would be and more." That night, for the first time since they'd married, they sat together on the porch after dinner. Not talking much, just being together. Rose leaned against Jack's shoulder, careful of his injured ankle. His arm came around her, and finally, after a month of being married strangers, they started to feel like they might actually become partners.
Maybe even more than that someday. Maybe even friends.
Maybe even something deeper, but they had time. And now they had trust. That was a start. That was everything. 3 months into their marriage, things were getting better. Jack's ankle had healed, though he still limped a bit on cold mornings. The awkwardness between them had faded. They talked more easily now. laughed at small jokes, worked together around the house and ranch. Rose had started to let herself believe that maybe this marriage could actually work. Maybe she could be happy. Maybe Jack really didn't regret his choice. Then came the Saturday they went to town for supplies. They needed basic things: flour, sugar, salt, some cloth for Rose to make new shirts for Jack. It was a bright morning, and Rose was actually looking forward to the trip. She'd been cooped up on the ranch for weeks, and it would be nice to see people, to browse the general store, to maybe even see Lily. They drove the wagon into town around mid-morning. The main street was busy with the Saturday crowd. People were out doing their shopping, catching up on gossip, enjoying the nice weather. Jack helped Rose down from the wagon, his hand steady under her elbow. They walked into the general store together. The little bell above the door jingled as they entered. The store was crowded. Rose recognized most of the faces. Mrs. Henderson was there, of course, examining fabric by the window. Alice, the banker's daughter, was looking at hair ribbons. 2 other women Rose knew from church were near the counter. Jack went to speak with Mr. Davis, the store owner, about feed prices. Rose wandered toward the fabric section, running her fingers over the different materials, thinking about what would make good work shirts. That's when she heard the voices. They were trying to be quiet, but not quiet enough. Mrs. Henderson and another woman, Mrs. Cooper, stood just on the other side of a tall shelf. "I saw them at church last Sunday," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "Did you see his face? He looked absolutely miserable." "Well, can you imagine?" Mrs. Cooper replied. "Being trapped with her? The poor man probably regrets his decision every single day." "I give it another few months at most," Mrs. Henderson said. "He'll start looking elsewhere. Men always do when they realize what a mistake they've made." Rose stood frozen, her hand still touching the fabric. Each word was like a knife. Mrs. Cooper continued, "I heard from someone who heard from someone else that he's already been seen talking to other women in town. Can't say I blame him, really. It's almost sad," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She probably thought she'd finally found happiness. But reality always sets in eventually. A man like that, young and strong, settling for someone like her? It was never going to last. Rose felt sick. The room seemed to spin. All the confidence she'd been building, all the hope she'd been allowing herself to feel, crumbled in an instant. She turned and walked quickly toward the door. She needed to get out, needed air, needed to be anywhere but there. "Rose? Rose, wait." Jack called after her, but she didn't stop. She pushed through the door and onto the street, walking fast, not knowing where she was going, just needing to move. Jack caught up with her halfway down the street. "Rose, what's wrong?" "What happened?" "Nothing," Rose said, her voice tight. "I just felt unwell. Can we go home?" "Of course, but yeah, please, Jack, I just want to go home." The ride back to the ranch was silent. Rose stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. Jack kept glancing at her, clearly worried, but he didn't push. He just drove them home. For the next several days, Rose withdrew into herself. She cooked meals but barely ate. She cleaned mechanically without really seeing what she was doing. She spoke only when spoken to, and then just in short, simple answers. Jack noticed, of course he did. But Rose couldn't explain. How could she tell him what she'd heard? How could she admit that she'd believed, even for a moment, that maybe she deserved to be loved? On the 4th day, Lily came to visit. Rose was surprised to see her sister ride up on their old horse. Lily usually sent word before visiting. "Rose, we need to talk," Lily said, dismounting and tying the horse to the post. They sat on the porch, and Rose poured them both some water. The afternoon was warm, and the ranch was quiet. Jack was out checking on the cattle. "What's wrong?" Rose asked. "That's what I came to ask you," Lily said. "Jack came to see me yesterday. He's worried sick about you. He said you've been different since you went to town last Saturday, and he doesn't know why." Rose felt tears prick her eyes. "It's nothing. Rose Mitchell Morrison, you are the worst liar I've ever met. Tell me what happened." And so Rose told her. She told her about the conversation she'd overheard, about Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Cooper, about every cruel word they'd said. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "They were right, Lily. I was fooling myself. Jack's going to realize what a mistake he made, and he's going to leave, and I'll be alone again. Except this time it'll be worse because I let myself hope. I let myself believe I could be happy." Lily grabbed Rose's hands. "Rose, stop, just stop. Did you hear what you just said? You're believing gossip from 2 of the meanest women in town over your own husband. But what if they're right?" "What if they're not?" Lily countered. Rose, I've seen how Jack looks at you. I was there when he chose you. I've visited you here. That man cares about you. Why are you letting bitter strangers tell you what your own marriage is like? Rose wiped her eyes. Because I'm scared, Lily. I'm scared that this is too good to be true. That I don't deserve this. That's garbage and you know it, Lily said firmly. You deserve happiness just as much as anyone else. Maybe more after all the years you've spent letting people make you feel small. They talked for another hour. Lily didn't let Rose hide or make excuses. She pushed and prodded until Rose started to see things more clearly. By the time Lily left, Rose felt a little better. Not completely better, but enough to realize she needed to actually talk to Jack instead of shutting him out. That evening, when Jack came in for dinner, Rose was waiting for him. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Of course," Jack said, immediately setting aside his hat and coat. "Rose, I've been worried. Please tell me what's wrong." So Rose told him. She told him everything, including her fears and insecurities. It was hard laying herself bare like that. But Lily was right. She couldn't let gossip destroy what they were building. When she finished, Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. "Get your shawl," he said. "What? Why?" "We're going to town." "Jack, it's almost dark." "What are you—" "Trust me, please." Rose didn't understand, but she got her shawl. They rode into town in the fading light. By the time they arrived, the street lamps were being lit. Jack drove the wagon straight to the nicest restaurant in town, the one place where everyone who was anyone went to eat dinner on Saturday nights. "Jack, what are we doing?" Rose asked as he helped her down. "We're having dinner," he said simply. The restaurant was packed. Every table was full. The Saturday crowd was there in force. Conversations and laughter filled the air. When Jack and Rose walked in, several conversations stopped. People stared. Jack didn't seem to notice or care. He asked for a table, and they were seated near the center of the room, right where everyone could see them. For a moment, the restaurant was quiet. Then Jack stood up. He stood tall and looked around the room, making eye contact with various people. His voice was calm but carried clearly through the space. "I want to say something, and I want everyone here to listen," he said. 3 months ago, I chose Rose to be my wife from a room full of women. If I had to do it again today, I'd make the exact same choice. I'd choose her 100 times over. The room was completely silent now. Rose felt her face burning, but Jack continued. "Rose is the strongest person I know. She's kind, she's capable, she works harder than anyone I've met. She saved my life during that storm last month. She makes our house a home, and I'm grateful every single day that she agreed to marry me." He looked directly at Mrs. Henderson, who had the grace to look away. "If anyone in this town has a problem with my wife, they have a problem with me. And I'd suggest they keep their opinions to themselves." Then Jack sat back down, picked up his menu, and said to Rose in a normal voice, "What do you feel like eating tonight?" The restaurant slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed, though many were quieter now. The waiter came to take their order, professional and polite. They ate their dinner slowly. Jack told Rose a funny story about one of the horses. Rose told him about a complicated dress order she'd received. They talked and laughed like they were the only two people in the room, but Rose was aware of every eye on them. She was aware that Jack had just publicly declared his commitment to her in front of half the town. He'd stood up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. When they finished eating and prepared to leave, several people actually nodded respectfully to them. Alice, the banker's daughter who'd expected Jack to choose her, stopped them at the door. "That was well said, Jack," Alice said quietly. Then she looked at Rose. "You're lucky to have each other." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Rose nodded. "Thank you." On the ride home, Rose leaned against Jack's shoulder. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," Jack replied. "You're my wife, Rose. That means something. That means I stand beside you, support you, defend you, in good times and hard times. Even when I let gossip get inside my head and shut you out for days?" Jack smiled in the darkness. "Even then. Though maybe next time, talk to me first." Winter came early that year. By November, there was already snow on the ground, and the cold bit through even the thickest coats. Rose had never minded winter before, but this year felt different. The temperatures dropped lower than usual. The wind howled constantly, and the storms were fierce. Jack prepared as best he could. He brought extra hay into the barn for the cattle. He checked and rechecked the fences. He made sure the house had enough firewood stacked to last through the worst weather. He was thorough and careful, the way he was about everything. Rose did her part too. She preserved extra vegetables. She made warm quilts. She knitted thick socks and scarves. They worked together, preparing for whatever winter might throw at them. But you can't prepare for everything. It was mid-January when the worst storm hit. Jack had gone out early that morning to check on some cattle in the far pasture. The sky had been gray and there was snow in the air, but nothing that seemed too dangerous. Jack had dealt with winter storms before. He knew what he was doing. "I'll be back by noon," he told Rose, kissing her forehead. This simple gesture had become natural between them over the past months. Small touches, small affections. They were growing closer every day. "Be careful," Rose said, as she always did. "Always am," Jack replied, as he always did. But noon came and went. No Jack. Rose wasn't too worried yet. Sometimes checking on cattle took longer than expected. Maybe he'd found a fence that needed emergency repair. Maybe the snow had slowed him down. But by 2 o'clock, when Jack still hadn't returned, Rose started watching the window more closely. The snow was falling harder now. The wind was picking up. She could barely see the barn from the house anymore. By 4 o'clock, the storm was raging. Snow came down so thick it was like a white curtain. The wind screamed around the house, rattling the windows. And there was still no sign of Jack. Rose paced the floor, wringing her hands. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. Jack should have been home hours ago. Even if he'd found problems with the cattle or the fences, he would have started back by now. He wouldn't risk being caught out in a storm like this, unless he hadn't had a choice, unless something had happened. By 5 o'clock it was getting dark and Rose made a decision. She wasn't going to sit in the house waiting while Jack might be hurt or lost or worse. She had to go look for him. She bundled herself in every warm thing she owned. 2 pairs of wool socks, her heaviest boots, 3 layers of skirts, 2 coats, a thick shawl wrapped around her head and shoulders, gloves, a scarf over her face. Then she went to the barn. The cold hit her like a physical blow the moment she stepped outside. The wind tried to push her back. The snow stung her face even through the scarf. But she pushed forward 1 step at a time until she reached the barn door. Inside, the horses were restless. They knew something was wrong. They stamped and whinnied nervously. Rose picked the 2 strongest horses, the ones who knew the land best. Her hands were already numb as she worked to harness them to the sled. It took longer than it should have. Everything was harder in the cold. Her fingers wouldn't work right. The leather straps were stiff and stubborn. But finally she got them hitched. She climbed onto the sled, took up the reins, and headed out into the storm. The wind immediately tried to tear her off the seat. Snow pelted her from every direction. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The horses were nervous, pulling against the reins, wanting to turn back to the safety of the barn. But Rose pushed them forward. She knew roughly where the far pasture was. She'd been there with Jack before in better weather. She tried to remember landmarks, but everything looked the same in the white storm. Just snow and more snow and darkness. She called out Jack's name every few minutes, but the wind snatched her voice away. She could barely hear herself over the roar of the storm. Still she kept calling, "Jack, Jack, Jack." An hour passed, maybe more. Rose had lost track of time. She was so cold she couldn't feel her feet anymore. Ice had formed on her eyelashes. Her face hurt from the wind. The horses were struggling through drifts that came up to their chests. Several times Rose thought about turning back. This was crazy. She could die out here. She could get lost and freeze to death, and then both she and Jack would be gone. But every time she thought about turning around, she pushed forward instead. If Jack was out here, he needed her. She couldn't give up. She was about to stop and rest the horses when she heard something. A sound that wasn't wind or snow. She pulled the horses to a stop, straining to hear. There it was again, a voice. Faint, almost impossible to hear, but definitely a voice. "Jack!" she screamed. "Jack, where are you? Here!" The voice came back, weak but unmistakable. "Over here." Rose drove the horses toward the sound. And then she saw him. Just a dark shape in all that white, but it was him. He was on the ground about 20 feet from the sled, partially buried in a snowdrift. Rose jumped down and ran to him, stumbling through the deep snow. "Jack, oh God, Jack, what happened?" He was conscious, but barely. His face was pale, his lips blue with cold. "Horse threw me," he said through chattering teeth. Spooked by something. Couldn't get up. Ankle. Rose looked down and saw his left foot was twisted at a wrong angle. broken or badly sprained. Either way, he couldn't walk on it. And he'd been lying out here for hours, slowly freezing to death. "I'm going to get you to the sled," Rose said. "It's going to hurt. Already." "Hurts," Jack managed to say. Rose was a strong woman. She'd always been strong. But Jack was dead weight, unable to help much with his injured ankle and weakened by cold. Still, she got her arms under him and pulled, dragged. Inch by inch, she moved him through the snow toward the sled. It was the hardest physical thing she'd ever done. Her back screamed. Her legs trembled. Her arms felt like they might give out. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Jack's life depended on her. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she got him to the sled. Getting him up into it was another nightmare. She had to lift and push and pull while Jack tried to help with what little strength he had left. But somehow they managed it. Jack collapsed in the back of the sled, shaking with cold. Rose took off her outer coat and wrapped it around him. Then she climbed back onto the seat, took up the reins and turned the horses toward home. The journey back was terrifying. The storm had gotten even worse. The horses were exhausted. Rose could barely see anything. She was navigating by instinct and prayer, hoping she was going the right direction. Behind her, Jack had stopped talking. That scared Rose more than anything. "Jack," she called back. "Jack, stay awake." "Talk to me." No response. Rose pushed the horses harder. They had to get home. They had to. She didn't know how long they traveled. Time had become meaningless. There was only the storm, the cold, the desperate need to get Jack somewhere warm. Her hands were frozen to the reins. She couldn't feel her face anymore. But she kept going, and then, like a miracle, she saw a light. The lamp she'd left burning in the window. The house. They'd made it. Rose drove the sled right up to the door. She jumped down, nearly falling because her legs wouldn't work properly, and ran to the back. "Jack, Jack, we're home. Stay with me." Getting him inside was another battle. He was barely conscious now, unable to help at all. Rose half carried, half dragged him through the door and got him in front of the fireplace. She threw more wood on the fire until it was roaring. Then she went back out into the storm, got the horses unhitched and into the barn. She couldn't leave them out in this weather. Even though every second away from Jack terrified her, she took care of the horses. They'd saved both their lives tonight. Finally, she stumbled back inside. Jack was where she'd left him, still shaking, still blue-lipped. Rose's own hands were so numb she could barely move them, but she forced them to work. She got Jack out of his wet, frozen clothes. She wrapped him in every blanket and quilt in the house. She heated water and made him drink it even though he could barely swallow. For the rest of that night and all the next day, Rose worked. She kept the fire burning. She warmed Jack slowly, carefully, the way you're supposed to with someone who's been badly cold. She made hot broth and got him to drink it a spoonful at a time. She checked his ankle, which was definitely broken, and splinted it as best she could. She didn't sleep. Every time Jack seemed to drift off too deeply, she woke him up, terrified that he wouldn't wake again. She talked to him, sang to him, told him stories, anything to keep him conscious and fighting. The storm raged for 2 more days. They were completely cut off from town, from help, from everything. It was just Rose and Jack and the howling wind outside. On the 3rd day, Jack opened his eyes, really opened them, and looked at Rose with awareness. "You came for me," he said, his voice still rough. "Of course I did," Rose said. She was sitting beside him, her eyes red from exhaustion and smoke. "You're my husband." "I could have died," Jack said. "You could have died coming after me." "But we didn't," Rose said firmly. "We're both here. We're both alive. That's what matters." Jack reached for her hand. His grip was weak but real. "Rose, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said a long time ago." Rose's heart skipped. "What is it?" But before Jack could answer, his eyes closed again. He'd fallen back asleep, exhausted from just those few sentences. For 3 days after the storm, Rose barely left Jack's side. She slept in the chair next to his bed, waking every few hours to check on him, to make sure he was still breathing, still warm, still alive. The fear of losing him had settled deep in her chest and wouldn't leave. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness. The cold exposure and the broken ankle had taken a serious toll on his body. Rose did everything she could. She kept him warm, kept him hydrated, changed the wrapping on his ankle when it needed it. She cooked nourishing soups and broths, feeding him small amounts whenever he was awake enough to eat. On the fourth morning, Rose woke in her chair to find Jack watching her. Really watching her, his eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been since the storm. "You should be in bed," he said, his voice hoarse but stronger than it had been. "That chair can't be comfortable." Rose sat up quickly, wincing as her back protested. She'd been sleeping in that chair for days, and her body was reminding her she wasn't as young as she used to be. "You're awake." "Really awake." "I'm awake," Jack confirmed. He tried to sit up, then winced and fell back. "How long have I been out?" 3 days, mostly. You'd wake up sometimes, but you weren't really here." Rose poured him water from the pitcher beside the bed. "Here, drink this." Jack drank slowly, gratefully. When he finished, he looked at Rose more carefully. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was falling out of its pins. Her dress was wrinkled from sleeping in the chair. "You've been taking care of me this whole time," he said. It wasn't a question. "Where else would I be?" Rose replied. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Rose, I need to tell you something. I tried to tell you before, but I keep falling asleep or getting too weak to talk. But I need to say this now, while I'm thinking clearly." Rose sat down in the chair again, her heart beating faster. "All right." Jack shifted carefully, trying to sit up more. Rose helped him, stuffing pillows behind his back until he was comfortable. When he was settled, he took her hand. "When the sheriff told me to pick a bride from that room," Jack began, "I'd already made my choice. I'd decided on you weeks before that night ever happened." Rose stared at him. "What?" "About 2 months before that night in the town hall, I saw you in town," Jack continued. "It was a regular day, nothing special. I was picking up supplies. And I saw you on the street helping Mrs. Chen." Rose remembered. Mrs. Chen, the old Chinese woman who ran the laundry. Her bags had torn and her groceries had spilled everywhere. People had walked past her, too busy or too prejudiced to help. "You stopped," Jack said. "You didn't hesitate. You got down on your hands and knees in the dirt and helped her pick everything up. Then you carried her groceries all the way to her house, even though it was clearly out of your way. I followed at a distance, watching. When you left her house, you were smiling. You'd just done something kind and it made you happy. No one had seen. No one knew but you and Mrs. Chen. You did it just because it was right." Rose didn't know what to say. She'd had no idea anyone had noticed that small act. "Then another day I saw you with those 2 orphan boys who are always hanging around the church." Jack continued. "I saw you give them your lunch. Your whole lunch. You went hungry that day so they could eat, and you made it seem like they were doing you a favor by taking it." Rose's eyes filled with tears. Those boys, Tommy and Ben, they'd looked so hungry that day. She couldn't just walk past them. "And then there was the Rodriguez family," Jack said. "I was in the general store when Mr. Peterson started saying terrible things about them. Just because they're from Mexico, he was saying they shouldn't be allowed in town, that they were stealing jobs, all sorts of hateful nonsense. And you stood up to him. You, this quiet seamstress, you looked him right in the eye and told him he was wrong. You defended people who couldn't defend themselves." Jack squeezed her hand. "Rose, I saw who you really were. Not on the surface, not what other people saw. I saw your heart. And that's when I knew. If I ever got a chance to choose someone to spend my life with, it would be you." "But you didn't know the sheriff would set up that arrangement," Rose whispered. "No, I didn't," Jack admitted. "That was luck. Or fate, or a miracle. When he told me I could pick any woman I wanted as a reward for saving his life, I couldn't believe it. It was like someone had given me exactly what I'd been wishing for but didn't think I'd ever get." "You could have just courted me," Rose said. "The normal way." Jack shook his head. "Could I have?" "Rose, be honest. If I'd just walked up to you on the street and asked to court you, what would you have said?" Rose thought about it. She knew the answer. "I would have said no. I would have thought it was a joke or a cruel prank or that you wanted something from me." "Exactly," Jack said gently. "You would have never believed that a man could genuinely want you. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because people had spent so long making you feel like you weren't worth wanting." He was right. Rose knew he was right. She'd built such high walls around herself that no one could have gotten through them the normal way. "But that night in the town hall," Jack continued, "you couldn't say it was a joke. You couldn't think I was trying to trick you. I chose you in front of the whole town. I chose you first before anyone else. There was no way to deny that I wanted you." Rose was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you were settling. All these months, part of me kept thinking that you'd just picked me because you felt sorry for me. Or because of some land I supposedly have, or because you were grateful to the sheriff and I was the only one no one else would miss. No, Jack said firmly. Never. Rose, I chose you because you are exactly the kind of person I wanted to spend my life with. Kind, strong, brave, genuine. Everything that matters in a person, you have it. He pulled her closer, ignoring the pain in his ankle. And Rose, I need to tell you something else. Something I've been feeling for a while now, but was too scared to say. What? Rose asked, barely breathing. I love you, Jack said. I'm in love with you. Not just grateful, not just fond of you. Actually in love. I think I started falling in love with you on our wedding day, when you smiled at me and I realized I was the luckiest man in the world. And every day since then I've fallen a little bit more. Rose sobbed. Not sad crying, but the kind of crying that comes from feeling too much all at once. Joy and relief and disbelief and hope all mixed together. In the storm, Jack continued, when I was lying there in the snow, thinking I might die, my only regret was that I'd never told you, that you might never know how much you mean to me. So I'm telling you now while I have the chance. I love you, Rose. I love you so much. I love you too, Rose said through her tears. I've been so scared to say it, scared to even feel it, but I do. I love you, Jack. When I thought I might lose you in that storm, I couldn't breathe. The thought of a world without you in it was unbearable. Jack pulled her onto the bed beside him, careful of his injured ankle. He held her close, and Rose held him back, and they stayed like that for a long time. Just holding each other, feeling the truth of the words they'd finally said. I don't regret my choice, Jack whispered into her hair. Not for 1 second. You are everything I hoped for and more. Even though I'm not pretty like Alice? Rose asked quietly. Even though I'm big and awkward and take up too much space? Jack pulled back so he could look at her face. Rose, you're beautiful. Your face is beautiful. Your body is beautiful. Your heart is beautiful. But even if you weren't, even if you looked completely different, I would still love you. Because I didn't fall in love with your appearance. I fell in love with who you are. He touched her face gently. And you don't take up too much space. You take up exactly the right amount of space. Your size is part of what makes you strong. Strong enough to save my life in that storm. Strong enough to lift me into that sled. Strong enough to drive through a blizzard when most people would have given up. Your body is a gift, Rose. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you otherwise. Rose kissed him then. It wasn't their first kiss, but it was the first kiss where they both knew, without any doubt, that they were loved. 5 years passed. 5 years that felt both like a lifetime and like no time at all. 5 years that transformed two lonely people into a family, a house into a home, and doubt into certainty. The Morrison Ranch had grown and prospered. With Rose's business sense and Jack's hard work, they'd expanded their land, increased their cattle, and built a reputation for quality and fairness. Other ranchers came to Jack for advice. People traveled from neighboring counties to buy their livestock. But the ranch's success wasn't the most important thing that had changed. The most important changes were the ones you couldn't measure in acres or dollars. The small 2-room house had been expanded. Jack had built on 3 more rooms over the years, working on winter evenings and slow days. Now there was a proper kitchen, a sitting room, and 2 additional bedrooms. The house was filled with warmth and life and laughter. In one of those bedrooms slept Tommy and Ben, the 2 orphan boys Rose had once given her lunch to. They were 15 and 13 now, no longer the skinny, scared children who'd hung around the church hoping for scraps. Jack and Rose had taken them in 3 years ago, officially adopting them a year later. The boys worked on the ranch, learned reading and writing from Rose in the evenings, and called Jack and Rose Ma and Pa without any hesitation. In the other bedroom was little Grace, who'd just turned 2. She was Rose and Jack's daughter, born after years of hoping and praying. She had her mother's brown eyes and her father's smile, and she was absolutely fearless. Even now, Rose could hear her chattering away in her crib, talking to herself as she often did when she woke up. Rose stood in the kitchen making breakfast for her family. It was a Saturday morning, bright and clear. She could hear Jack outside, teaching the boys how to repair a fence properly. His voice drifted through the window, patient and encouraging. No, Ben, hold the hammer like this. There you go. Tommy, hand me those nails. Perfect, Rose smiled. Jack was a good teacher, patient with mistakes, quick with praise. The boys had thrived under his guidance. They'd gone from skinny, scared orphans to strong, confident young men who knew they were loved and wanted. There was a knock at the door. Rose wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. Lily stood there, her own baby balanced on her hip. Lily had married a farmer named Daniel 2 years ago, and they lived about 5 miles away. The sisters saw each other at least twice a week. Come in, Rose said, taking her nephew from Lily's arms. I was just making breakfast. There's plenty. They settled at the kitchen table, babies playing on the floor, and talked the way sisters do. About their children, their husbands, the town gossip, their plans for the week. It was comfortable and easy, the kind of friendship that only comes from years of trust and love. Are you going to the dance tonight? Lily asked. The town held a dance every month in the same town hall where Jack had chosen Rose 5 years ago. We are, Rose confirmed. Jack insisted. You know how he loves to dance. It was true. Jack loved dancing with Rose. He said it was because he liked having an excuse to hold her close in public, but Rose thought it was more than that. She thought he liked showing the town again and again that he'd made the right choice, that he was happy, that they were happy. That evening, the Morrison family drove into town. Tommy and Ben rode in the back of the wagon, excited about the dance. This would be their first time going as official members of the family, bearing the Morrison name. Grace sat on Rose's lap, pointing at everything they passed and naming it in her toddler vocabulary. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. Music spilled out into the street. People stood in groups outside talking and laughing. When the Morrisons walked up, several people called out greetings. Evening, Jack. Rose, boys. Looking forward to seeing you dance, Jack. Rose, I need to talk to you about that dress order. The hostility that had once greeted them was long gone. It had taken time, but the town had eventually accepted what Jack had known from the beginning. That Rose was remarkable, that their marriage was real and strong, that they belonged together. Rose's dressmaking business had helped. She'd started taking orders a year after the wedding, first just from neighbors, then from women in town, then from women in other towns. She made clothes for all sizes, all shapes, and she made them well. She treated every customer with respect, whether they were rich or poor, thin or heavy. Word spread, and now she had more business than she could handle. Women who'd once whispered cruel things about her now came to her shop, asking for her expertise. Mrs. Henderson herself had ordered 3 dresses from Rose last year, and she'd been polite and respectful every time. Rose had been gracious about it because holding grudges served no purpose. People could change. People could grow. Inside the hall, the dance was in full swing. The same room where Rose had once stood in a line, feeling humiliated and unwanted, was now filled with friends and neighbors who respected her. She saw people she'd helped over the years. Mrs. Chen, whose groceries she'd carried. The Rodriguez family, who'd become close friends. Other women she'd made dresses for who'd become customers and then friends. Jack handed Grace to Tommy, who was surprisingly good with his little sister, and led Rose onto the dance floor. They moved together easily, naturally. 5 years of dancing together had made them smooth and practiced. Rose no longer worried about her size or whether people were watching. She just enjoyed being in her husband's arms. Happy? Jack asked, smiling down at her. Very, Rose replied honestly. As they spun around the floor, Rose saw Alice standing by the refreshment table. Alice had been married and divorced twice now. She'd married a wealthy merchant who'd turned out to be cruel. Then she'd married a handsome drifter who'd left town with another woman after 6 months. Alice looked tired now, older than her years, and there was a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Their eyes met across the room. Alice lifted her glass in a small salute and Rose nodded back. There was no triumph in the gesture, no sense of I won, just acknowledgement. 2 women who'd taken different paths and ended up in very different places. Catherine, the schoolteacher, was there too, still unmarried. She seemed happy enough, surrounded by friends laughing at someone's joke. Not everyone needed to be married to be happy. Rose understood that now in a way she hadn't before. After several dances, they took a break. Jack got them both punch and they stood together watching their family. Tommy was dancing with a girl from town, his face red with shyness and excitement. Ben was talking to a group of boys his age, gesturing wildly as he told some story. Grace was asleep on Lily's shoulder, worn out from all the excitement. You know what I was thinking about today? Jack said quietly. What's that? That night. 5 years ago, standing in this room, about to choose a bride. He looked around the familiar space. I was so nervous. My hands were shaking. I was terrified you'd say no. I almost did, Rose admitted. I was so sure it was some kind of mistake or joke. But you said yes, Jack said, turning to look at her. You took a chance on me, on us. Best decision you ever made? Rose pretended to think about it. Well, it's certainly been interesting. Let's see, we've had a broken ankle, a near-death experience in a blizzard, 2 teenage boys who eat everything in sight, a toddler who never sleeps, and a ranch that always needs something fixed, Jack laughed. When you put it like that, it sounds exhausting. It is exhausting, Rose said. Then she smiled. It's also wonderful. Yes, Jack, best decision I ever made. Saying yes to you was the moment my real life started. Jack kissed her forehead. Mine too. As they stood there holding hands and watching their family, Rose thought about how far they'd come. 5 years ago, she'd been a lonely woman who thought she'd never be chosen, never be loved, never have a family of her own. She'd built walls so high around her heart that she thought nothing could break through them. But Jack had seen past those walls. He'd seen her when she thought she was invisible. He'd chosen her when everyone else had overlooked her. And most importantly, he'd been patient enough to wait for her to believe she deserved to be chosen. Their life wasn't perfect. They had hard days and arguments and struggles like any couple. The ranch work was difficult. Money was sometimes tight. The boys got into trouble. Grace had colic for months. But through it all, they had each other. They had trust and love and partnership. Rose had learned something important over these 5 years. She'd learned that she wasn't too big, wasn't too much, wasn't taking up too much space. She was exactly right, exactly enough, exactly herself. And that was something worth celebrating. Later that night, after they'd driven home and put the children to bed, Jack and Rose sat on their porch. It was a warm evening for early spring, and the stars were bright overhead. They sat in their rocking chairs, holding hands across the space between them, just being together in comfortable silence. Do you ever think about that night? Rose asked. About how different things could have been? Sometimes, Jack admitted. If the sheriff hadn't set up that arrangement, if I hadn't saved his life, if you hadn't agreed to come that night, so many things that could have gone differently. We might never have met, Rose said. I don't believe that, Jack said firmly. I think we would have found each other somehow. Maybe it would have taken longer.